Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Williams, Senior Editor at MGMA and host of the MGMA Podcast Network. We are back with another MGMA Insights Podcast. We are here with Kelly Smith. Kelly is an experienced practice management coach and consultant and has a lot of experience with practices. We got to meet by happenstance. Kelly attended one of our recent MGMA events, and we connected through that. So that was pretty neat. So first of all, Kelly, I just want to welcome you to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you and I talked a few weeks ago, and you were kind of bringing me up to speed on your interaction with MGMA and how much you had enjoyed the event. We've had so many events lately, I can't remember which one it was. So bring me up to speed. Which event did you go to, and tell me something you learned there.
So I attended the private practice event back in August, and it was my first MGMA event, and I found it to be very useful. I was most excited, I think, by the process with the revenue cycle. Those ladies had a lot of really wonderful information, and I'm implementing some of that into my practice, actually, and I'm very, very excited for that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay. So let's just learn a little bit about Kelly Smith then and bring that to our MGMA audience. Love to let people know kind of the journey that people have. So what brought you to healthcare in the first place when you were, I don't know, a student or growing up or a young adult? And at some point you went, I want to make healthcare a career. Tell me about that.
So I actually wound up in healthcare really by just chance. A friend of mine had a sister that had an opening. I was fresh out of college and still kind of figuring out what I wanted to do. And I started working in a medical oncology practice as a receptionist. I was there for about 9 months and then moved into the world of surgery. Worked both in breast surgery as well as in colorectal surgery. So I've been in management now for about 16 years.
Wow. Okay. So talk about your experiences then in those different practices. What is it about practice management and being in that healthcare setting that has you moving into that coaching side of it, that consulting side of it? Talk about that transition.
So the first practice that I worked in, the breast surgery practice, I was there for about 15 years.
Okay.
And the physician that I worked for I found her to be extremely inspiring. She pushed you to be your best self. You represented her, so she had high standards, which I think, looking back is amazing. And I'd like to see more physicians, have a higher standard because I think it's really important, particularly when it comes to patient care. In both of my long-term positions, there's been a level of cancer care, and that's sort of a whole different element. In the breast surgery practice, and being pushed, to reach new limits, one of the things that I had done was to participate in the breast cancer 3-day, which was a 3-day, 60-mile walk to raise money for breast cancer. And at the time, I was not really exercising. Like, this was a big thing for me. And I wasn't so sure that I was going to be able to do it. And when I did, there was such a feeling of accomplishment that's really hard to put into words. But, you start to get connected to the patients. There's a lot of contact, and this is a difficult time, obviously, for people. And so to be entrusted, with their care is a real privilege. And I developed a lot of relationships from that first practice and really grew a lot, both I feel personally as well as professionally.
Yeah, well, thank you for being part of that. In my own family, we've had, challenges with breast cancer. Lost a grandmother to that disease many, many years ago. But it's anytime someone is involved in that in any way, it's most appreciated. So thank you for that. Now, one of the things that connected us, you met with our senior editor, Chris Harrop. He was at that private practice event. He connected us because you had come up to him, asked him some questions about work-life balance, burnout, some different things like that. And we've got several MGMA podcasts that we devote to those, whether it's our mindful medicine podcast episodes or some other ones as well. So you had shared that you once felt overwhelmed in your own role. So talk about that. Talk about that overwhelm, what was going on with you at that time in the practice, and how you were dealing with it at the time.
So the overwhelm overlapped for me personally and professionally.
Okay.
And it took me a while to sort of figure out what was happening. I think from a personal standpoint, I really felt sort of stuck in where I was. And it took me a while to understand that what was happening was in my personal life, things were shifting. And I was at a point where my values really no longer aligned with my work because I was wanting a lot more flexibility, a lot more work-life balance. And being in a management role, it's really important to have a presence in the office. So there was this conflict that was happening internally. And when I realized what it was, that was a big moment because then it allowed me to sort of do something about it. There's a lot of traditional 9-to-5 mindset in the world of practice management for most of your specialty practices. Primary care is a little different. There's a bit of extended hours there, but for the most part, the specialties are open 9-to-5. And so there's this demand for people to be there within those hours. And I think that we've learned, certainly from, the pandemic, that things could be done differently. And so that was a help in starting to take a fresh look at things, how to be a little bit more outside the box, how people could be in a position where they wouldn't have to necessarily make a choice between being a good employee and being a good parent, for example. I have a lot of people on my team who are single parents. I'm also an only parent. And that presents its challenges. And there's a lot of, I think, guilt and conflict when you're always at one place and feeling like you should be at the other, and sometimes feeling like you're not doing either one well. And that creates a struggle. And that is sort of where I became very interested in this idea of changing the way we look at traditional, practice management.
Well, let's talk about that then a bit more. You and I connected, I think it was about a month or so ago. We talked about some of the things that you're doing. You've developed some learning modules. You've been really studying this idea of what is work and what is work-life balance and what does all of that look like. So talk about that.
So for that side of it, I started doing some research online. And then I think one of the best decisions that I made that was a pivotal moment for me was I actually hired a coach. And I had a significant shift in my mindset where the old me would have said that I couldn't afford to hire a coach. And the new me realized I couldn't afford not to.
Yeah.
And it has really sort of began a whole shift for me in the way I view a lot of things. And I think that that's really probably going to be the first real challenge in getting sort of this word out there. Because I think that in private practices, hospital-run practices, it kind of doesn't matter. A lot of people are sort of stuck in how we do things. If you go in and you kind of ask those questions, you ask, why do you do this thing this way? And almost always is the answer you're going to get is, this is how we've always done things.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they can't even tell you why.
Right.
And so, taking a step back and sort of reassessing, is there a better way to do things? Is there a more efficient way to do things? Why are we doing these things? Like, what things move the needle, and starting to redirect where we focus. I've always felt like there's just been this, you go in every day and there's fires that kind of come up that have to be put out, and you just sort of do them and you sort of go through the motions, but we don't take the time to take a step back to measure the things that need to be measured, study those results, and then pivot and adapt as we need to start to see success. And I just feel like it's more a matter of going through the motions than taking the time to sort of break down these things and consider doing things differently and doing them in a way that enhances productivity and creates just an overall happy, healthy environment for everyone involved.
So I have to take a step back and ask you a question, because you said you reached out to a coach. You couldn't afford not to have a coach. I have heard people talk about coaches, career coaches, or whatever nomenclature we want to attach to it. And I don't think I've ever asked the question, what is a coach? I mean, I had coaches in sports, but when you get into the business world, I mean, do they have a whistle? Are they having you do burpees? I mean, what's going on in this coach? Are you a player? I mean, a coach-player relationship? Are you a client? Talk about this coach relationship here and what a coach means to you.
So I think that's a really great question because this goes back to the mindset. A lot of people complete school and maybe stop their learning. And I think that there's this idea of having constant feedback and constant ways to look at improvement. And, we're all sort of stuck in our space where we see things through our lens. Mm-hmm. But when you have somebody who's a little bit more removed from the situation that can help you assess it and say, why aren't you doing this? Or what about this? Have you tried this? And a lot of times things that you just don't think about for somebody who is, a couple of steps ahead of where you are. So whether you use the term, I use the word coach. I like that word. Mentor, it's another word. But, the idea that there's an elevated perspective of the big picture that's not, somebody who's directly in it, because a lot of times they can see things that maybe you can't. And also sort of somebody to push you, because I think that there are a lot of highly qualified people who shy away from bigger opportunities because they don't think they're good enough. There's that whole imposter syndrome, right? And I think a lot of human beings experience these things. And to have somebody to sort of point them out and say, no, you can do this. Here's what you need to do. Here are some steps to take. And it's not like they give you all the answers, but they give you a level of guidance that maybe you weren't able to attain on your own. And so I just look at it as a way to consider things that I haven't before and have now ongoing improvement from somebody who's not directly in my circle, who can be objective.
Right. I love that you brought up that example. And I've seen that as well in both the professional and the personal life, that if you can find someone who's outside of the situation itself, they can at least give you more of like you said, an objective point of view with it, as opposed to when you're in it, there's that mindset. There's that mindset like you almost have the tunnel vision where, how do I get out of this? How do I get us? Whereas I would say, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this, say you then reverse the role and you're the one who's objective and not emotionally tied to the situation, and then you see a similar situation someone else is going through. It's like, I can see the way to help you. I just can't help myself. I don't know. Have you ever experienced that in your own life?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. It's very easy to give the advice when you're not the one that has to make the changes.
That's
and I
right.
think that's going to be another challenge in this approach that I want to take with coaching, because I think it's hard for some people to not feel a little defensive when you try very nicely to point out some areas that perhaps could be tightened up, right? Mm-hmm. When you're involved, it's your practice, for example, say you're the physician and you're the owner, right? And you've built this business and you've been doing it, say, for 30 years. And now someone's coming in off the street who doesn't know you or your practice,
right,
and has all these things to say about how you could be doing things better. The ability to be able to separate the emotional part of that, and I think that's probably a challenge for a lot of people, for me as well. I feel like I give great advice when I'm not the one that has to do the work. But even in my own life, some of these changes that I've made in this process, and what I liked about my coach and why I selected her, was that I found that she had a very holistic approach. She wasn't just here to discuss business. She had a focus on your overall health and well-being. Since I've started this journey, I have prioritized exercise. I have really prioritized my sleep in a way that I never have before. But when you want a different result, to be willing to do that work that you need to do consistently and not necessarily get this overnight result, that level of consistency and having that grit and that drive, the discipline, that's the word, I think, is the discipline.
Right.
That's hard. And it takes a while to see the results of your labor. But I think it's really important, and it would be great if more people were open to it, because I think that we've been repeating a cycle for a long time. And I think that as people, we tend to complicate things way more than they need to be. And
Right.
when you can strip that stuff down and almost start over and build a system that makes sense and do things that allow people to have it a little bit easier. Like work shouldn't always have to be hard. We shouldn't have to do things the hard way if there is a better way. A
Okay.
lot of physicians are very set in their ways. I'm set in my ways.
Sure.
So, and I own that, but
Yeah.
I'm really seeing the value in making significant changes. And over time, the rewards are there and it does pay off. You just have to be patient.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So I want to hit on two key points here. So one of them is compassion. One of them is it's good to be touchy-feely or just be more open-minded and open-hearted in that way. But there's also the productivity side of it. So let's start with compassion first. You've got some really interesting things here that you've really worked through on developing a compassionate workplace. So what does that mean?
So again, I think it's human nature where people tend to be quick to judge a situation, judge a behavior. We work very closely together. In my current practice, there are a fair amount of us in a pretty small space. And, if somebody comes in and they haven't had their best day, and somebody else doesn't maybe understand that they're going through something, it's a knee-jerk reaction, right? If somebody snaps at you, to immediately snap back.
Right.
And it takes a lot of restraint and self-control to be able to take a breath and just look at them and say, are you okay? Because you have to recognize that when the reaction is not proportionate to whatever the episode was, the exchange that took place, there's always something underneath what's happening. And at work, it can be a fine line, right? Because some people are very private.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a fine line. You don't want to be intrusive. But when somebody recognizes that you noticed that they were struggling today and you took the time to ask and to, lend an ear if they need it or do whatever you can do to help them, I think that things like that build real relationships. And this idea, like I feel like when I worked in a hospital setting, it's a very corporate setting and there's very much like a separation of your work life and your personal life. And it's almost like it's discouraged to talk
Mm-hmm.
too much about your personal life, in the workplace. I'm pretty much the polar opposite of, and to be honest, it's two things. First thing is that it's who I am. And
Yeah.
I'm just never going to change. I'm not cut out for the corporate world, when it comes to that. I think there is a level of authenticity that people really respect and that it builds trust and it creates a space where people are less afraid to open up and be
Mm-hmm.
honest with you. And as a leader, I don't know how I could possibly be successful in my role if I don't create an environment where people are comfortable to open up and come speak to me if something is bothering them. Because if they can't feel comfortable enough to tell me, you can't help them. And then you're at a standstill. So I feel like it's really important to, again, there are boundaries that have to be in place, and I
Right.
acknowledge that. But I think that you can't go wrong when you care about people and you are kind and compassionate and empathetic with whatever's happening. And I think it will ultimately earn leaders a great deal of respect.
Yeah. All right. Part two of that is that's the productivity side. Now, I want to get this right. You have created a system, a program. It's called 3 Easy Steps to Increase Productivity, Efficiency, and Profits. So talk about this program. How did this thing get off the ground? Where'd you come up with it? And tell us about the kind of the machinery behind it.
So that is almost like a little mini course that I used to introduce the digital course that I recently created called Workplace Wellness 360. I wanted to find a way to give people a sample of what I'm talking about and help them, take a few little steps in their own workplaces to see that implementing small changes will have some kind of a result to sort of hopefully develop some confidence in the program that I'm looking to endorse. So I feel like, the first piece where you create a culture of wellness is about sort of laying a foundation. I think that, as a patient, when you walk into physician office, you can instantly tell what the relationships are like. If everyone gets along, if it's warm and welcoming, whether it's tense, all of those things, it doesn't take long for people to be able to feel that. And so I feel like having a solid foundation is extremely important. My next step talks about nurturing your team. I feel like, again, things that are simple, not necessarily easy, but that are simple, things like meeting on a regular basis, things like as a leader going out and asking for feedback and creating an environment where your staff feel comfortable to be honest with you. And I feel like that by itself, that one's going to take time, because I think the first time somebody does that, you're asking your team to look at, the person that they view as their boss and tell them what they're doing wrong. Right. Most people kind of freeze up and, think it's a trick question or, but again, if you don't know how people are really genuinely feeling, you can't adjust your behavior or you can't adjust the environment. And that act of building trust, I think, is really, really important. And as you are making progress, little baby steps, to celebrate every win, because this industry is tough. I feel like since the pandemic, people have become really difficult to deal with. And I think it's because everybody is so stressed out. Yeah. People are stressed financially. There's a million and one things. And a lot of times it gets taken out on the poor employee who is trying to help them. So the employees need positive feedback. They need support and encouragement. I feel like that's really important. And then step 3, I talk about inspiring positive change. And this, again, sort of promotes people getting outside the box, getting outside of the ways that we traditionally do things, and trying to find better ways to do them. Because when that starts happening, productivity will definitely increase. And for me, that's a simple step. Once you figure out how to get it and make it a routine, the change is the hard part. It becomes part of the routine, and you're reviewing your procedures annually, and productivity will increase, and as a result, so will your profit. And that makes everyone happy.
All right. Well, Kelly Smith, practice management coach and consultant, thank you for joining us on the MGMA podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, well, that is going to do it for this episode of MGMA Insights Podcast. I want to make sure everybody knows, check out the episode show notes and the article that we're going to place on mgma.com. You'll be able to find Kelly's free guide, 3 easy steps to increase productivity, efficiency, and profits in your practice. We'll put a direct link in there. Until then, thank you all for being MGMA podcast listeners.